The law office smelled of old leather and expensive cologne, the kind that clings to wood paneling and never quite fades. Margaret Chen sat in a wingback chair, watching two men who looked so similar they could have been twins, except for one crucial detail. They refused to acknowledge each other's existence. Richard Pemberton, 62, sat rigid in his tailored navy suit, every button fastened, every crease perfect. His eyes remained fixed on the mahogany table between them as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Thomas Pemberton, 60, slouched in his chair with studied casualness, wearing jeans and a blazer that had seen better days. His jaw was clenched so tight Margaret could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin as he stared out the rain-streaked window at the gray Seattle afternoon. "Gentlemen," the attorney began, his voice carrying the practiced patience of someone who'd mediated too many family disputes. He shuffled papers with deliberate precision. "Your father's will is quite clear. The estate, the house, the Pemberton building, the business holdings, the investment portfolio, goes to both of you equally. In total, we're looking at approximately $4 to $2 million. He paused, letting the number settle. Neither brother reacted. "However," the attorney continued, "there's a condition. A significant one." "Let me guess," Richard said coldly, his voice like ice water. "We have to work together. For 30 days minimum. Joint decisions on all major matters. If you cannot fulfill this requirement, the entire estate goes to charity. The American Foundation for Family Reconciliation, to be precise. Your father was quite specific about that." Thomas laughed, a bitter sound that seemed to scrape the air. "Of course he was. He's still trying to control us from the grave. Still trying to force us to be the sons he wanted instead of the ones he had." "Mr. Pemberton," the attorney said, leaning forward, "surely you can set aside your differences for 30 days. For $4 to $2 million. For your father's legacy." "No." Both brothers said it simultaneously, the word sharp and final. They flinched at the synchronicity, a ghost of the connection they'd once shared flickering across their faces before vanishing behind fresh walls of resentment. The attorney sighed, gathering his papers. "I'll give you 1 week to reconsider. After that, we begin the process of transferring everything to the foundation." They left the office separately. Richard through the front door, back straight, stride purposeful. Thomas through the side exit 5 minutes later, hands shoved deep in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the rain. Just like always. Just like they'd done at their mother's funeral, their father's birthday parties, every family gathering for the past 3 decades. The next day, Margaret Chen stood in her small apartment in the International District, looking at a photograph she kept on her mantel. 2 boys, maybe 8 and 6 years old, arms slung around each other's shoulders, gap-toothed smiles bright as sunshine. They wore matching Superman capes she'd made from old bedsheets. Behind them, a younger version of herself in a crisp nanny's uniform, her black hair not yet streaked with gray. She remembered that day. They'd been playing superheroes, saving the world from imaginary villains. Richard had been Captain Justice. Thomas had been the inventor. They'd been inseparable. Her phone rang, jarring her from the memory. "Ms. Chen, this is Sarah Pemberton. I'm Richard's daughter." The voice was young, professional, and desperate. I know this is unusual, but we're running out of options. The family lawyers have tried. 3 different therapists. A mediator. A conflict resolution specialist. My father and uncle haven't spoken in 30 years. Not at my wedding. Not at my grandmother's funeral. Not when my cousin was born. Nothing. And now with my grandfather's will. Margaret closed her eyes. She'd heard rumors over the years. Seen the occasional mention in the society pages. Richard at one charity event, Thomas at another, never together. But hearing it confirmed still hurt. Those boys. Her boys. What happened between them? Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Nobody knows. They won't say. My father just says Thomas knows what he did. My uncle says Richard chose to believe the worst. But you raised them, Ms. Chen. You were there during their childhood. You knew them before whatever broke them. Maybe you can fix this. Sarah, I was their nanny 40 years ago. I left when Richard went to college. I'm 73 now. I'm not sure what I could possibly do that trained professionals haven't already. Please. Sarah's voice cracked. You're our last hope. The lawyers say if they don't reconcile in 6 days, we lose everything. But more than that, I've never seen my father hug his brother. My children have never met their uncle. We're not whole. We're missing half our family because of something that happened before I was even born. Please, just try. Margaret looked at the photograph again. Those boys, arms around each other, believing they could save the world. I'll try, she said quietly. Want to know what happened next? Subscribe for more stories about the lies we tell ourselves and the truths that set us free. Margaret made one request, to meet with each brother separately, in the old family house where she'd raised them. The Pemberton estate sat on 3 acres in Madison Park, overlooking Lake Washington. As Margaret's taxi pulled up the circular driveway, memories flooded back. Teaching the boys to ride bikes on this very driveway. Thomas falling and skinning his knee, Richard helping him up. Always helping each other up. The house hadn't changed much. Same grand staircase with the oak banister she'd polished every week. Same portrait of great-grandfather Pemberton in the foyer, stern and disapproving even in oils. Same library where she used to read them stories before bed, adventure tales, mysteries, anything they wanted. Richard arrived precisely on time, as she knew he would. Punctuality had been drilled into him since birth. Ms. Chen. He shook her hand formally, his palm dry and cool. I appreciate you making the effort, but I need to be clear. I'm here because Sarah begged me to come. I don't expect this to change anything. Sit down, Richard. Something in her voice, the same tone she'd used when he was 8 and had tracked mud through the house, made him obey. Some habits run deeper than pride. They sat in the library, surrounded by thousands of books. His father's collection. His grandfather's. Generations of Pembertons. Do you remember the tree house? She asked. His face softened microscopically, a tiny crack in the armor. Of course. You and Tommy built it together. Took you all summer. You were 12. He was 10. Your father said you'd never finish it, that you'd get bored and quit like always. But you didn't. You worked on it every day. Tommy did the design. He drew up actual blueprints. You did the construction, made sure everything was safe and sturdy. When you finished, you slept in it for a week straight. You were inseparable back then. That was a long time ago, Ms. Chen. What happened, Richard? What broke you two apart? Richard's jaw tightened. His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, curled into fists. He knows exactly what he did. I don't. Tell me. He was silent for a long moment. Then, the day before I left for college, I was supposed to meet Sarah, my girlfriend, now my wife, at her parents' house for dinner. First time meeting them. Absolutely crucial. Her father was old-fashioned, very particular about respect and responsibility. The dinner was at 6 o'clock sharp. Thomas was supposed to give me a ride. My car was in the shop. Margaret nodded, encouraging him to continue. I waited. 6 o'clock came and went. 6:30. 7. I called his apartment. No answer. I called his friends. Nobody had seen him. Finally, at 8:30, I gave up. I'd missed the entire dinner. When I called Sarah's house to apologize, her father answered. He was furious. Said I was irresponsible, disrespectful, not the kind of young man his daughter should be dating. It took months to repair that relationship. Sarah's father didn't trust me for years. And Thomas. He showed up at the house at 10 o'clock that night. Casual as anything. Said he forgot. Just forgot. I'd told him 3 times how important it was. I'd reminded him that morning. And he forgot. Richard's voice cracked, showing the hurt beneath the anger. When I confronted him, he barely apologized. Just shrugged and said, "Sorry, Richie, I got caught up with something." Like it meant nothing. Like I meant nothing. And you believed he simply forgot. What else was I supposed to believe? He'd always been irresponsible. Always. Dad was right about that. Thomas never took anything seriously. And that night proved I couldn't count on him when it mattered. So I stopped trying. Margaret made careful notes. Then she thanked him and asked him to leave. Thomas came the next day, 15 minutes late, which she also expected. "I don't know why you're bothering, Ms. Chen," he said, slumping into the same chair Richard had occupied. "Richard made his choice 30 years ago. Nothing you say will change his mind. He's as stubborn as Dad was. More, maybe." What choice did he make? To believe the worst of me. To believe I was the screw-up little brother who couldn't be trusted. To believe exactly what Dad had been telling him for years. Thomas paced the library, unable to sit still. I didn't forget that day. I would never forget something that important. Richard was my brother. My best friend. I would have done anything for him. Then what happened? Thomas stopped pacing. Stared at a shelf of books without seeing them. I got in a car accident on the way to pick him up. Some drunk driver ran a red light at 5th and Main. T-boned my car on the driver's side. Totaled my Honda. I woke up in the hospital with a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and a fractured wrist. Margaret felt her chest tighten. Richard doesn't know this. I tried to tell him. Thomas's voice rose with old frustration, old pain. I called him from the hospital as soon as I could. 3 times. He wouldn't take my calls. When I got out 2 days later, I went to his dorm at the university. He saw me coming and locked the door. Literally locked me out. I shouted through the door, trying to explain. He told me to go away, that he never wanted to see me again. You didn't try after that. Of course I tried. I sent him letters. 5 of them. He returned every single one unopened. I went to his classes. He walked past me like I was invisible. At Thanksgiving, when we were both home, he wouldn't speak to me. Wouldn't even be in the same room. Thomas's hands shook. He decided I was the irresponsible little brother who let him down, and nothing, not the truth, not the evidence, not our entire childhood, could change his mind. So eventually, I stopped trying. What was the point? Margaret processed this carefully. You have proof of the accident. Hospital records. Police report. Insurance claim. It's all documented. It happened at 5:47 p.m. at the intersection of 5th and Main. I can show you the scar from where the window glass cut my face. He turned his head, showing a thin white line along his jaw. But Richard never asked to see any of it. He'd already made up his mind. Margaret spent 3 days thinking, planning, preparing. She'd seen this before in her decades of working with families. Misunderstandings that calcified into grudges. Simple failures of communication that became canyons of resentment. She knew what to do. She called both brothers to the house simultaneously, telling neither that the other would be there. They arrived within minutes of each other. Richard first, of course. Then Thomas. When Thomas walked into the library and saw Richard, he turned immediately to leave. Sit down. Margaret's voice could have frozen water. It was the voice that had stopped fights, ended tantrums, commanded respect from 2 generations of Pemberton children. They Saturday. Richard on the leather couch near the window. Thomas in the armchair by the fireplace, as far apart as the room would allow, neither looking at the other. Thomas, Margaret said, standing between them like a referee. Tell Richard about the accident. He won't believe me. He never has. Tell him anyway. Thomas spoke to the carpet, his voice flat. I was on my way to get you. I left my apartment at 5:30, giving myself plenty of time. At the intersection of 5th and Main, a drunk driver ran a red light doing about 50 miles an hour. Hit my car on the driver's side. The impact knocked me unconscious. When I woke up, I was in an ambulance. They took me to St. Mary's Hospital. I had a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and a fractured wrist. I was there for 2 days. Richard said nothing, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the arm of the couch. Richard, Margaret said gently. There are hospital records, police reports, accident reports, insurance claims. This isn't a story. This is documented fact. Thomas didn't forget. He was in the hospital. Something flickered across Richard's face. Confusion, then shock, then something that looked like pain. Why didn't you just tell me? I tried. Thomas's head snapped up, anger flashing. You wouldn't. Both of you, stop. Margaret held up her hand. Listen to me. Richard, Thomas tried to tell you. Multiple times. You were hurt and angry and you refused to listen. That was wrong. Thomas, you gave up too easily. You let your pride stop you from trying harder. That was also wrong. You were both 19 and 21 years old. You were young and stubborn and hurt, and you made mistakes. But that was 30 years ago. 30 years. Are you really going to throw away your brother, your only sibling, over a misunderstanding from 3 decades ago? The silence in the library was absolute. Outside, a crow cawed. Inside, Margaret could hear both men breathing. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. Thomas looked up, shocked. In 30 years, Richard had never apologized for anything. I should have listened. I should have at least looked at your letters. I should have. Richard's voice broke. He covered his face with his hands. God, Tommy, I've missed you. I've missed you so much. Thomas stood. For a moment, he just looked at his brother. Then he crossed the room in 3 strides. Richard stood too. They embraced for the first time in 3 decades, and both men were crying. Margaret watched, tears streaming down her own face. Behind her, she heard a soft sob, Sarah, hidden in the hallway, filming on her phone. We'll accept the inheritance together, Richard said when they finally pulled apart. We'll run the business together. Make decisions together. Like Dad wanted. Like we should have all along, Thomas agreed, wiping his eyes. Like we would have if we'd just talked to each other. They started meeting weekly at the house, making plans for the business, laughing over old memories, filling in the gaps of 30 lost years. Richard learned about Thomas's career as an artist, the gallery showings, the struggles. Thomas learned about Richard's children, his success in the investment world, the pressure he'd felt to live up to the Pemberton name. The lawyers drew up partnership papers. Sarah planned a massive family reunion, both sides together for the first time. Richard's wife baked Thomas's favorite cake, the lemon pound cake with raspberry frosting that Margaret used to make, for their first joint birthday celebration in 30 years. The business partnership was formalized. They signed the papers together, both of them grinning. Everything was perfect. Margaret went home feeling lighter than she had in years. She'd done it. She'd fixed them. She'd brought her boys back together. 3 weeks later, Margaret's phone rang at 2 a.m., jarring her from sleep. Ms. Chen. Sarah's voice was shaking, thick with tears. Something's happened. Something terrible. Margaret's heart sank, dread pooling in her stomach. What? What happened? They had a fight. The worst one yet. Dad says he never wants to see Uncle Thomas again. Uncle Thomas has already left town. Ms. Chen, it's over. Whatever you fixed, it's worse now. So much worse. Margaret sat up in bed, turning on the light. Tell me exactly what happened. They were going through old business records at the estate, trying to understand Dad's holdings, the history of the family company. And Dad found documentation that Uncle Thomas sold his shares of the original Pemberton Manufacturing Company 25 years ago. The business that Grandpa built from nothing. The family legacy. He sold it to an outside investor. And Thomas says he swears he only sold because he desperately needed money for medical bills after another accident. But Dad says it doesn't matter why. He says Uncle Thomas betrayed the family legacy, sold out everything Grandpa built. They started yelling. Dad said Uncle Thomas was always a disappointment, always weak, always taking the easy way out. Uncle Thomas said Dad was just like Grandpa, cold and judgmental and impossible to please. Sarah was crying openly now. Ms. Chen, Dad said. He said at least when they weren't speaking, he had his memories of who Thomas used to be. Now those are ruined too. He says you made him vulnerable just so Thomas could hurt him all over again. He says the silence was better than this. Uncle Thomas said the same thing before he left. Margaret felt sick. Where did Thomas go? He drove to Portland. Said he was done. Said maybe the silence was better. At least then they weren't actively destroying each other. The next morning, Margaret sat with Sarah at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill. Her tea sat untouched in front of her. I failed you, Margaret said quietly. I failed them. You tried. You brought them together. They were happy for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of false peace before an even worse explosion. That's not healing, Sarah. That's a band-aid on a bullet wound. Margaret stared at her reflection in the dark tea. I was so sure I knew what the problem was. A simple misunderstanding. Clear it up, and everything would be fine. But I was wrong. What do you mean? I fixed the symptom, not the disease. I addressed the incident, not the wound beneath it. Margaret looked at Sarah. Your father and uncle didn't stop speaking because of a missed dinner. That was just the excuse. The trigger. The final straw. But the real problem was already there, waiting. Margaret sat alone in her apartment that night, staring at that old photograph. She'd been so confident, so certain she could fix them with one conversation, one explanation, one revealed truth. But she'd only scratched the surface. She'd only addressed the obvious problem, not the real one. And in doing so, she'd made it worse. She'd pushed them together before they were ready, before the real wounds had been acknowledged, let alone healed. Now they were hurt all over again, and this time it was partly her fault. She'd failed. Margaret couldn't sleep. For 3 nights, she lay awake, replaying everything. The meetings, the conversations, the reconciliation, the collapse. What had she missed? At 4 a.m. on the 4th night, she gave up and made tea. As she sat in her kitchen, watching the city lights through her window, she thought about her years with the Pembertons. She'd loved those boys. But she'd also seen how their father treated them. The constant comparisons. The impossible standards. The way Richard was held up as the golden child while Thomas was always the disappointment. She pulled out an old box from her closet, one she hadn't opened in years. Mementos from her time with the family. Photos of the boys at different ages. Report cards, Richard's straight A's, Thomas's creative projects marked down for not following instructions. A crayon drawing Thomas had made of her when he was 6, all stick figures and hearts. Richard's thank you note when she'd left their employment, written in perfect cursive. And at the bottom, an envelope she'd forgotten about. A letter from their father, written to her 5 years after she'd stopped working for them. She remembered receiving it, reading it, being unsure how to respond. Eventually, she'd filed it away and forgotten about it. Now she unfolded the yellowed paper with trembling hands. Dear Margaret, I hope this letter finds you well. I'm writing because I need to confess something to someone, and you're the only one who might understand what I'm trying to say. Richard and Thomas aren't speaking. Haven't been for 5 years now. Everyone thinks it's about that incident with the missed dinner, the car accident, the misunderstanding. The family believes if they could just clear up that one event, everything would be fine. But that's not really it, Margaret. That's not the truth. The truth is, I failed them. Both of them. For their entire lives, I compared them to each other. Richard was the responsible one, Thomas was the creative one. Richard was the heir apparent, Thomas was the spare. Richard got praise for following the rules, Thomas got criticism for breaking them. I never meant to pit them against each other, but that's exactly what I did. I made Richard feel like he had to be perfect to maintain my approval. I made Thomas feel like nothing he did would ever be good enough. I turned their relationship into a competition instead of a bond. Every achievement of Richard's was an implicit reminder to Thomas that he fell short. Every time Thomas did something his own way, I treated it as rebellion rather than creativity. That dinner incident, that missed ride, it was just the excuse they needed, the final straw. They were already primed to distrust each other because I'd spent their whole childhood making them compete for my approval instead of helping them support each other. I see it now, but I don't know how to fix it. Every time I try to talk to them about it, Richard tells me everything is fine and has moved on. Thomas won't take my calls at all. They are both protecting themselves from more of my damage. I've tried family therapists, mediators, interventions. Nothing works because I created this distance between them, Margaret. I did, and I don't know how to undo it. Please pray for them, if you still do that sort of thing. Pray they can undo what I've done before it's too late. Pray they can find their way back to each other despite my failures as their father. With deep regret, William Pemberton. The letter fell from Margaret's hands. She sat there as the truth settled over her like a heavy blanket. The feud wasn't based on a misunderstanding about a car accident. The misunderstanding was just the match. Their father had spent decades soaking the kindling, priming them to distrust each other, teaching them to see their relationship as a competition rather than a partnership. No wonder they fell apart again so quickly after the reunion. She'd addressed the spark, not the fuel. She'd explained the accident, but she hadn't addressed the lifetime of comparison, competition, and conditional love that made them so ready to believe the worst of each other. The brothers didn't just need to understand what happened that day 30 years ago. They needed to understand what had been happening their whole lives. They needed to grieve the father who'd loved them but also wounded them. They needed to forgive not just each other, but him, and themselves. They needed to acknowledge that their broken relationship wasn't about one incident. It was about a pattern, a lifetime of being told, subtly and not so subtly, that they were in competition rather than on the same team. She'd solved the wrong problem entirely. And now, because of her mistake, they were even more hurt than before. Margaret made 2 phone calls the next morning. To Richard, I need to see you again. Please. I know you're angry, but I have something you need to see. To Thomas, come home. One last time. After this, if you never want to speak to me again, I'll understand. Then she made a 3rd call, to Sarah. I need you to get them both to the house tomorrow at 2 p.m. Together. I know they don't want to see each other. Do it anyway. Ms. Chen, I don't think. Trust me. Please. One more time. They came, though reluctantly. Sat on opposite ends of the library again, the temporary reconciliation clearly over. The space between them felt even wider than before, the silence more bitter. Richard looked exhausted, older somehow. Thomas looked angry, his jaw set in a hard line. Margaret placed the letter on the table between them. Before you read this, I need to say something. I failed you. I thought your problem was a misunderstanding about one day 30 years ago. I thought clearing up that incident would fix everything. But misunderstandings don't cause 3 decades of silence. Not by themselves. Wounds do. Deep ones. Ones that go back much further than one missed dinner. What is this? Richard asked, looking at the yellowed paper. A letter from your father. Written to me 25 years ago, about 5 years after you stopped speaking. Read it. Both of you. They read together, leaning over the table, careful not to touch each other. As they read, Margaret watched their faces change. Confusion gave way to recognition. Recognition gave way to pain. When they finished, both men's faces were wet with tears. "He knew," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "He knew what he'd done to us." Richard's hands shook as he set the letter down. "All those years, I thought he was proud of me, that I was doing everything right. But he was just using me, using my achievements to make you feel inadequate. And I thought he was disappointed in me, that I was the family failure. So I tried to prove I didn't need him, didn't need any of you, didn't need the family or the business or the approval." Thomas looked at his brother. "That's why I sold those shares. Not just because I needed the money, because I wanted to hurt the family legacy. I wanted to reject it before it could reject me." "Oh, Tommy." Richard's voice cracked. It was the first time he'd used the childhood nickname in 30 years. "You were never the failure. You were never the disappointment. Not to me. You were the best part of our family. You were creative and funny and brave enough to be yourself. I was the robot, the one who did everything I was told because I was too scared to disappoint anyone. When you succeeded at everything, I felt like I was drowning, like there was no oxygen left for me. When you created things, when you followed your own path, I felt like a fraud, like I was just going through the motions of a life someone else had scripted for me." They sat with that truth, the real truth, the one that had been there all along, underneath the surface explanation. Finally, Margaret spoke softly. "Your father loved you both. I know that. I saw it. But he was broken in his own ways, from his own father, probably, and his father before him. Broken people break people. That dinner, that accident, the misunderstanding, it wasn't really about that day. It was about all the days before. All the times he made you feel like you had to choose between each other and his approval. All the times he made your relationship a competition instead of a bond. All the times he should have brought you together but instead drove you apart. How do we fix this?" Richard asked, looking at Margaret with desperate eyes. "The real this, not just the surface. How do we fix decades of damage?" The brothers didn't reconcile that day, or the next day, or even the next week. Instead, they did something much harder. They started real therapy. Not a mediator trying to resolve a specific conflict. Not a lawyer trying to make them cooperate. Real, deep, painful family therapy with a trauma specialist who understood intergenerational wounds. They had to grieve their father together. Had to acknowledge that he'd loved them and harmed them simultaneously. That both things could be true. That he'd done his best with his own broken understanding of fatherhood, and that his best still hadn't been enough. They had to talk about Richard's perfectionism, born from years of being held up as the golden child and terrified of falling from that pedestal. About how he'd internalized his father's voice and couldn't separate his own wants from what he thought he should want. They had to talk about Thomas's self-sabotage, born from years of feeling like the disappointment and deciding if he was going to fail anyway, he might as well fail spectacularly. About how he'd rejected the family before they could reject him, but in doing so, rejected his own brother too. They had to learn to talk to each other without their father's voice in their heads, without the constant comparison, without the competition. It took 6 months before Richard could tell Thomas he was proud of him without Thomas hearing it as condescension or patronizing. Before Thomas could hear genuine admiration instead of implied criticism. It took 8 months before Thomas could succeed at something, sell a painting, have a gallery show, achieve anything, without Richard feeling threatened or diminished by it. Before Richard could feel genuinely happy for his brother's success instead of anxiously measuring it against his own. They had to learn that they were both wounded, that neither of them had escaped their childhood unscathed, that Richard's success had cost him something too, the ability to know who he really was beneath all the achievement. The inheritance deadline came and went. They agreed, together, to donate it all to a foundation for family therapy services, specifically for families dealing with intergenerational trauma and sibling estrangement. They called it the William Pemberton Second Chance Foundation. Neither of them needed the money anyway. They'd both made their own fortunes. What they needed was something $42 million couldn't buy: each other. Their brother. Their childhood friend. The person who knew them before the wounds, who remembered who they'd been when they'd built tree houses and worn Superman capes and believed they could save the world. Margaret received an invitation a year and a half later. The envelope was thick, expensive paper. Inside, an invitation to a gallery opening. Thomas's gallery, she realized. He'd finally done it, opened his own space to showcase his art. At the bottom, a handwritten note. Ms. Chen, please come. Both of us want you there. We have something to show you. With love and gratitude. Richard and Tommy. She arrived to find the brothers standing together at the gallery entrance, greeting guests. No awkwardness. No forced politeness. Real warmth. Real ease. Ms. Chen. Thomas hugged her, and she was struck by how much more relaxed he seemed. The tension she'd always seen in his shoulders was gone. You came, Richard said, embracing her too. His smile reached his eyes in a way she'd rarely seen, even when he was a child. I wouldn't miss this for anything. They walked her through the gallery together, side by side. Thomas's paintings were stunning, vibrant explosions of color, emotional and raw and alive. Abstract pieces that somehow captured feeling rather than form. Richard helped with the business plan, the marketing, the financial structure, Thomas explained. But he let me keep the creative vision pure. Didn't try to make it more commercial or safe or marketable. Just supported what I wanted to create. Because it's brilliant, Richard added. I never understood art before. Not really. But watching Tommy create, seeing what he can do, I get it now. Why he couldn't just be another businessman in a suit. Why he needed to do this. They showed her painting after painting. A series about childhood, 2 boys in Superman capes. A series about loss, empty chairs at a dinner table. A series about healing, broken pottery repaired with gold, the Japanese art of kintsugi. And at the center of the gallery, the largest painting. 2 trees growing from separate roots, twisted and gnarled, clearly damaged. But above, their branches intertwined, supporting each other, creating a single canopy of leaves that reached toward the light. That's us, Thomas said quietly. Yeah, Richard agreed, his voice thick with emotion. That's us. Broken roots but connected branches. Not the same tree, but still supporting each other. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah approached Margaret. How did you know? That they needed more than just an explanation. That they needed to go deeper. Margaret smiled sadly. I didn't. Not at first. I got it completely wrong the first time. I thought I could fix them with one conversation, one revelation. But sometimes failure is a better teacher than success. My failure forced me to look deeper, to ask harder questions. And it forced them to do the same. She paused, looking at the brothers across the room, laughing together. Have you ever had to start over? Had to admit you were completely wrong about something and try a totally different approach? It's humbling. But sometimes humility is exactly what we need. Sarah nodded slowly. I think I'm learning that now. With my own family. With my kids. I thought I had all the answers, but maybe I'm asking the wrong questions. That's wisdom, Margaret said. Knowing that you don't know. Being willing to be wrong and start over. Later, as Margaret prepared to leave, both brothers walked her to her car together. The foundation is fully funded, Richard said. We're starting with 5 family therapy centers in the Seattle area. Free services for families dealing with estrangement, intergenerational trauma, sibling conflict. We're calling it the Second Chance Foundation, Thomas added. Because everybody gets it wrong the first time. The question is whether you're willing to admit it and try again. We want you on the board, Richard said. If you're willing. You don't have to make decisions or do any real work. We just want your wisdom, your perspective. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. I'd be honored. They hugged her goodbye, both of them at once, sandwiching her between them like they used to do when they were small boys who'd had nightmares and needed comfort. As Margaret drove away, she looked in her rearview mirror. The brothers stood together under the streetlight outside the gallery, talking animatedly about something, gesturing with their hands. Thomas threw his head back, laughing at something Richard said. Richard clapped his brother on the shoulder. Not the boys from the photograph. Something better. Something earned through pain and honesty and the courage to look at ugly truths. Something real. Margaret thought about the letter from their father as she drove home through the Seattle night. William Pemberton had seen what he'd done wrong but hadn't known how to fix it. He'd tried interventions and mediators and guilt, but none of it had worked because he'd been trying to force a solution instead of allowing his sons to find their own path to each other. She'd made the same mistake initially. Tried to force a quick fix, a simple solution to a complex problem. But sometimes the best thing you can do isn't to fix people. Sometimes it's to help them see what really needs fixing. To give them the truth, however painful, and then trust them to do the hard work themselves. The brothers had done that work. Were still doing it. Would probably always be doing it, because healing isn't a destination, it's a practice. She'd learned something too. Sometimes the obvious problem isn't the real problem. Sometimes what looks like a simple misunderstanding is actually a symptom of something much deeper. Sometimes making things worse is the only way to discover what really needs healing. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't the right answer. It's the courage to admit you don't have all the answers and the humility to start over when you get it wrong. 3 months later, Margaret sat in the library of the old Pemberton house one last time. The brothers had decided to turn it into the flagship center for the Second Chance Foundation. The library would become a counseling room. The living room, a group therapy space. The kitchen, a place for families to share meals together as part of their healing process. We wanted you to see it before we open, Thomas said, showing her the renovations. This room, where you read us stories, where we had our first failed reconciliation, where we read Dad's letter together, it felt right to make it the heart of the center. Richard added, we've hired the therapist who worked with us. Dr. Martinez. She's training a whole team. We've got funding for 5 years of operations and commitments from other donors after that. Your father would be proud, Margaret said. Maybe, Richard said thoughtfully. Or maybe he'd be uncomfortable with how honest we're being about his failures. But that's okay. We're not doing this for him anymore. We're doing it for other families. Other siblings who are one misunderstanding away from 30 years of silence. Thomas nodded. We're doing it so other people don't waste as much time as we did. So they don't need a near miracle and a 73-year-old nanny with old letters to save them. Margaret laughed. I'm 74 now. Thank you very much. They toured the rest of the house together. In each room, Margaret saw ghosts of the boys they'd been. The dining room where they'd had family dinners, where their father had compared their report cards. The staircase where they'd raced each other. The backyard where the old tree house still stood, weathered but solid. We're keeping the tree house, Thomas said, noticing where she was looking. As a reminder, we built that together. We can build other things together too. At the grand opening of the Second Chance Foundation's first center, Margaret sat in the front row as the brothers addressed a room full of donors, therapists, and families who needed help. Richard spoke first. My brother and I lost 30 years. 30 years of birthdays and holidays and everyday moments. 30 years of being there for each other. We can't get that time back. But we can help other families not make the same mistakes. Thomas continued, we thought our problem was a misunderstanding. It wasn't. It was much deeper than that. and the first attempt to fix it actually made things worse. But making it worse was necessary. It forced us to look at the real issues, the hard issues, the ones we'd been avoiding our whole lives. This foundation is for families who are ready to do that hard work, Richard said. For siblings who've stopped speaking. For parents and children who can't find their way back to each other. For families torn apart by things that happened years ago but still hurt today. We don't promise quick fixes, Thomas added. We promise honest work, professional help, and the understanding that healing is messy and painful, and sometimes you get it wrong before you get it right. Richard concluded, "My brother and I are still healing. We probably always will be. But we're doing it together now. And that makes all the difference." The room erupted in applause. After the event, Margaret found herself alone with the brothers one last time. "There's something we want to give you," Richard said, handing her a small package. Inside was a framed photograph. The one from her mantel, the two boys in Superman capes. But next to it, a new photo. The brothers today, standing in the exact same spot in the backyard, arms around each other's shoulders. Older, grayer, marked by the years apart. But together again. At the bottom, an inscription. "To Margaret, who taught us that sometimes you have to break something completely before you can rebuild it the right way. With love, your boys." Margaret held the frame to her chest, unable to speak through her tears. "Thank you," she finally managed, "for letting me be part of your story, for teaching me that I didn't have all the answers, for showing me that real healing is worth the pain of getting there." "Thank you for not giving up on us," Thomas said, "even when we'd given up on ourselves." "Thank you for being brave enough to be wrong," Richard added, "and for showing us that being wrong isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning of finding the right answer." Sometimes we solve the wrong problem. Sometimes we make things worse before they get better. Sometimes the obvious answer is a trap, and the real solution is buried much deeper. But if we're brave enough to start over, to look deeper, to ask harder questions, to admit when we're wrong, we might just find what we were looking for all along. Not a quick fix, not an easy answer, but something real, something worth the struggle. Something that lasts. Have you ever had to start over? Have you ever fixed the wrong problem only to discover the real issue was much deeper? Share your story in the comments. And if this resonated with you, subscribe for more stories about the lies we tell ourselves, the truths that set us free, and the messy, beautiful work of healing what's broken.